So Orico wants $399 for this 4-bay RAID drive enclosure, which certainly isn't cheap, especially with today's hard drive prices. But with onboard hardware RAID transfer speeds boasting up to 20 gigabits per second and a max capacity for all 4 of its drives of 104 terabytes, maybe that's not such a bad price. To see if it's worth the money, we're going to run through some real-world workflows on Linux and Mac OS, take a closer look at the software and RAID modes, as well as the documentation, product support, and in the end, well, I will definitely have some thoughts. Orico sent me this review unit at no charge, but no money changed hands. They haven't seen this video before it was uploaded. And as always, everything you hear will be my honest take. So inside the box, we have the 4-bay all-aluminum direct attached storage unit, or DAS, a USB Type-C cable, mounting hardware for your drives, a manual, a reset pen, power cable, and a screwdriver. The enclosure actually has its own built-in power supply, so we don't have to deal with any power bricks, and it also has its own built-in cooling fan. So it absolutely has great build quality and has a lot of heft to it. Inside the enclosure is the JM-S591, a USB to SATA bridge controller with built-in hardware RAID, giving you up to 6 different storage modes and transfer speeds up to 20 gigabits per second through its USB Type-C 3.2 Gen 2x2 connection. The unit accommodates a mix of 2.5 SSD as well as obviously 3.5 hard disk drives. And for my testing, I'm using only 3.5-inch hard drives with 2 2-terabyte Seagate Iron Wolf drives, a 1 terabyte Samsung hard drive, and a 500 gigabyte Western Digital drive. After securing my 2 Seagate drives to the drive bays with the provided screws, I slide them into the enclosure. The trays also use a simple release mechanism, so removing a drive feels very similar to what you might find on a Ugreen or Synology NAS. I then set the RAID mode on the back of the enclosure to RAID 0. The hardware RAID controller handles the striping between the 2 drives, while the computer simply sees them as a single storage volume. Now, RAID 0 uses striping, which essentially splits the data across both drives so they can read and write simultaneously. This can significantly improve performance, but there's no redundancy, so if either drive fails, you're kind of SOL. To start us off, I'm using Fedora Workstation 43, and after an hour of troubleshooting in the terminal and resetting the controller's RAID modes, I ended up installing GNOME disks to actually work with the RAID 0 volume, format it, and get it mounted. Now, Oracle calls this enclosure fully compatible with Linux, but the manual doesn't provide any Linux-specific instructions, and while it tells you to download Oracle's RAID management software, I couldn't find a Linux version anywhere on their website. So not off to a great start. What's more, there is no indicator on the enclosure telling you which RAID mode is actually active. So if the changes you made with the RAID mode on the back of the enclosure don't apply correctly, the enclosure could still be presenting the previous RAID configuration to the operating system. Conversely, GNOME disks can show me what the enclosure is presenting to Linux, but it can't tell me how the controller itself is configured. So yes, I finally got it working in Linux, but for a $399 enclosure advertised as fully compatible with Linux, I think Oracle could definitely have provided a little more guidance in this area. I also found it odd that smart data for the individual drives isn't exposed to GNOME disks through the enclosure, and that's another area where a dedicated RAID management software could potentially be very useful for drive health monitoring. For my first test, I copied about 16 gigabytes from my Fedora's internal NVMe drive to the 2-drive RAID 0, and we are connected over USB 3.2 Gen 1 port on my computer. The 16 gigabyte transfer completed in about 53 seconds, which is roughly 294 megabits per second. And that's a very good result for a 2-bay RAID 0 using mechanical hard drives. Next, we're switching over to my M4 Mac running macOS Tahoe. I'm connected to one of the Mac's Thunderbolt 5 ports, still using RAID 0, but since Apple Silicon Macs don't support USB 3.2 Gen 2x2 at 20 gigabits per second, our connection will fall back to a theoretical 10 gigabits per second, which is still pretty fast. However, Orico's site lists Mac OS 12 Monterey as the latest RAID management software, which was released back in 2021. What's more, when I downloaded the actual installer, it was dated December of 2019. So we're talking about a software installer that's more than 6 years old being offered for a brand new Enclosure that is heavily marketed toward Mac users for $399. That's not super encouraging. And while we're on the subject of Mac users, Oracle's marketing is a little confusing and leaning pretty heavily towards misleading. As an example, you've got this Mac Mini with 20 gigabits per second pointing directly at the Enclosure and 2 gigabit file in 1 second across the top, but the benchmark on the same Mac is only showing 1 gigabit per second. Another ad is even more on the nose, showing unmistakable ports on a Mac Pro, including the proprietary MagSafe connector right next to where it says USB 3.2 Gen 2x2 and USB 4 with a check mark. At the same time, you have the tiny disclaimer explaining that Thunderbolt on a Mac is actually limited to around 10 gigabits per second with this Enclosure. So yeah, the disclaimer is there, but you're presenting two conflicting messages. And maybe it's just me, but it comes off as a little sketchy when a disclaimer completely contradicts what's being advertised. Now, as blatant as I think the advertising is, the Enclosure does still work well on a Mac. The Mac's disk utility correctly recognized the 2-disk RAID 0 volume. So for my first test, I loaded about 15 to 20 minutes of video footage into Final Cut Pro and edited directly from the Enclosure. I could skim through the timeline, trim clips, and add pictures and additional footage with very little lag, which was honestly pretty impressive for a hard drive-based USB array. And also during the editing, power consumption stayed at around 18 watts, which is very efficient. For my next test, I copied just over 35 gigabytes of data over to the RAID 0 in 2 minutes and 8 seconds, which is about 273 megabytes per second, and that's consistent with our test on Fedora, which reported about 294 megabytes per second. I next moved on to RAID 1, and remember, RAID 1 mirrors the data between two drives rather than striping it, giving redundancy but without the same read and write performance we saw with RAID 0. So after switching to RAID 1, I copied the same 35 gigabytes of data over and got 3 minutes and 55 seconds, which works out to be about 151 megabits per second, obviously slower, but about what you would expect from a single mechanical hard drive. And just to be clear, our 10 gigabit USB connection isn't the bottleneck here. We're really seeing the practical limits of physical drives and the mirrored RAID configuration. Unfortunately, I don't have any spare solid state drives for testing because I suspect they would perform much better. Luckily, during the test, the power consumption was at a very efficient 14.1 watts. And I'll also note that the Enclosure was whisper quiet, no louder than it was sitting idle during all of my testing. I next wanted to test just a bunch of drives, or JBOD mode, using two 2 terabyte drives, a 500 gigabyte Western Digital drive, and a 1 terabyte Samsung. Now, JBOD can mean different things depending on the hardware, but on the Enclosure, it works out as a span, combining the capacity of multiple drives and presenting them as a larger volume. However, detection of my Samsung drive was a little bit inconsistent. Sometimes there was no activity light for its bay and the Mac didn't detect it. Other times the Mac's disk utility detected the drive, but the Enclosure's RAID controller didn't incorporate into the JBOD span, and Mac's disk utility showed the Samsung as a separate volume alongside the 4.5 terabyte spanned volume created using the other 3 drives. Just to rule out a bad hard drive, I swapped it for the same model 1 terabyte Samsung, and it behaved the same way. I also tried the drive in different bays and even swapped drive trays, but the behavior remained the same. So at this point, I can't be 100% sure if it's just drive incompatibility or if it's the bay. I don't think it's the enclosure, because after swapping different drives along different bays, it detected all of them the same way, but it just didn't want to work with the Samsung. So with the 3 disks of our Just a Bunch of Disk array, I ran another test with the same 36 gigabytes worth of files and got 3 minutes and 33 seconds, which is a tad slower than the RAID 1, but still very respectable. So overall, the Just a Bunch of Disk definitely does work, but the system itself might be a little picky on the drives you use. Obviously, I can't confirm that. But as it stands, the Samsungs I was using seem to be incompatible. Speaking of which, it would be nice if Orico provided some sort of drive compatibility list, but instead their website tells you to contact support before purchasing. So that's exactly what I did. I reached out via the support email listed and asked about compatibility of the Samsung that I was using, the HD 103SJ specifically, and asked if there was an available compatibility list. And while they responded very quickly, under 24 hours, their answer was basically just most SATA drives should work. So unfortunately, we're back to square one. I'm really no closer to knowing whether these particular Samsung drives are compatible at all. So if we were to ignore the lack of RAID software support and instructions for this DAS on both Mac and Linux, and the challenges with getting RAID modes to work on the Enclosure, I would say that this Enclosure is very serviceable. It's very quiet, has a great build quality, very energy efficient. The RAID modes I tested did ultimately work for the most part, and its speed is consistent with what I would expect from the drives and the configurations that we tested. However, unless you're using a Windows or Linux PC with 20 gigabit USB connections and you're running like 4 SSDs and RAID 0, you're probably not going to come very close to taking advantage of the Enclosure's potential speed. And if you're using a Mac, I can't in good faith recommend this unit for $399 at the moment. At that price, you're getting very close to a 4-bay NAS unit, which is, much more bang for your buck. In addition to offering RAID, you have a lot more functionality at your disposal. At $399, Orico needs to make a much more compelling case, no pun intended, for why people should buy this Enclosure, especially on a Mac. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to test it on Windows because the product launches this week, so I focused on Mac OS, which Orico appears to market this Enclosure pretty heavily towards, and Linux, which represents a larger portion of my viewers. And what with the grossly outdated Mac RAID software, missing Linux RAID software, no instructions for either platform, and some very questionable marketing choices, this Enclosure really misses the mark. And frankly, I really don't relish saying that, but at the end of the day, my responsibility is to all of my viewers, and my responsibility is to be transparent and to give you my honest take. So having said all that, Orico is providing a 30% discount to my viewers. That's certainly not going to affect my recommendation or change any of the concerns I've raised, but it does bring the price down to around $279, which is certainly more palatable than $399. But let me know in the comments if you think the Enclosure is priced fairly, regardless of the discount, or if you see yourself buying one. Also, sound off in the comments if you've used any of the Orico DASs before and what you're using it for in your workflow. Anyway, that's going to wrap up another video, tech fans. If you found this at all helpful, please make sure to give this video a like and make sure that you're subscribed to Mackey Tech if you haven't done so yet. If you'd like to support me, consider joining our Patreon community, where I've posted all of my tutorials as well as exclusive behind-the-scenes footage. A special shout out to my Tech Lite and Tech Essentials Patreon supporters. You know exactly who you are. And thank you all for watching. We'll be talking to you again very soon.